Yeah, let's get started. Let's start with a keynote. The future of data stewardship, enabling data commons and fair R principles. That's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and ready for AI. Before I go to Stefaan Verhulst, I just want to read a headline about I just saw this. This year, the European Medicines Agency and the national medicines agencies, they issued a work plan on data and AI in medicines regulations to 2028, so we're looking to the future today, with plans to leverage large volumes of regulatory and health data for better medicines that reach patients faster. So we'll be talking about the future, and of course, people like you are going to be involved in doing this. So let's hear from Stefaan Verhulst, co-founder and chief R&D officer, the GovLab. You're based at NYU with that, but also here, you're co-founder of the Data Tank Belgium. Stefaan, please. Big hand to Stefaan. And we'll be taking Slido questions, so for Stefaan. So keep that in mind. You can send them out starting now.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much for this kind introduction. Thanks for having me on this wonderful sunny Brussels day, which I not always remember Brussels as being sunny, but at least today we have luck. And again, thanks everyone for indulging me to reflect on where do we go from today and what's the future of data stewardship. A little bit about myself. I'm the co-founder, as was mentioned, of the GovLab, and I'm also a research professor at New York University at the Engineering School, where I'm also part of the Center for Urban Science and Progress. And at GovLab, we specifically focus on how do we transform the way we make decisions in society? How do we transform the way we design public services? How do we go about making decisions vis-a-vis public problems in new ways? And by doing that, we focus on kind of new assets, new ways of doing so. And of course, surprise, surprise, one of the key assets that we are focusing on and that we have been working with for the last 15 years is, of course, data. And by working with data for the last 15 years in order to develop evidence-based policymaking, to start developing new ways of public services, we came to one shocking realization, which many of you will probably have come to the same realization, is that if you want to be data-driven, surprise, surprise, you need to have data. And that turns out to be one of the biggest challenges in the data space. It's not just about generating data, it's about how do you have access to data and how do you make sure that the data you have access to is indeed interoperable and reusable, and as we will see, now also ready for AI. And that's the reason why 2 years ago we created the Data Tank, which is a do-and think tank here based in Brussels, but with people all over Europe to really start thinking about how do we accelerate access to data and how do we make sure the data we need is interoperable and then also reusable, which turns out to be not as straightforward as one might imagine. And again, everyone in the room here today, I'm talking to the converted, I'm sure. Now, before we go to the future, it might actually be good to reflect on what is the current situation. And as I said, having worked for the last 15 years on trying to provide access to data, whether it was open government data initially, and then private sector data, and then also open science data, of course, having worked for the last 15 years on this single problem, which is, as I said, one of the most important ones in today's data economy, I've become pretty optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. And so when I reflect on today's data ecosystem, I actually reflect in ways that Charles Dickens opens his Tale of Two Cities, which is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the spring of hope, and it was the winter of despair. And so let me start with the winter of despair, because what we see is actually a massive backsliding when it comes to access to data. We see a backsliding both at the level of open government data, especially the country where I'm supposed to be based in New York, for instance. We see actually massive closure of what was public, now data that is not available anymore. We see that the excitement with regard to open government data in many parts of the world, unfortunately, luckily not in Europe yet, but in many parts of the world, we see actually the excitement declining, and we see less data made available. Data that was available from the private sector, such as, for instance, X, in the past Twitter, which of course now, the question is, do you even want to have access to that data? But anyway, in either way, access to platform data has now been closed. Access to open science data is declining. I recently had a meeting with Creative Commons, and they see actually a decline in the use of their open data licensing. And so we see what I call the emergence of a data winter. At a time when we have an AI summer, when everyone is excited about advances in AI, we actually see a decline of data, and in part, that is also the result of how data has been extracted. Because what we also see is what I call Gen AI anxiety among the data holders. Data holders are getting anxious about providing access to the data that then can be extracted by a few large corporations for training and for fine-tuning of their models without a return on investment. And so if you look at, for instance, what is available on the public web, we actually see a decline of 3,000% of actually accessibility of the public web that we've had as well. And so that's why I call this the potential emergence, because we still can change it, but it's going to require actually a rethinking of how we go about providing access to data, and it also will require a rethinking of how we extract data in more shared benefit kinds of purposes as well. That's when I become pessimistic. But at the same time, we can also be optimistic, because what we have seen is that we also might enter actually the so-called fourth wave of open data. Fourth wave of open data because we had three waves before. The first, of course, wave of open data, especially in government, was freedom of information. Then, of course, about 10, 12 years ago, we saw this massive excitement around open government data portals, which exactly, as I said, here in Europe, especially at the European Commission level, is still alive and kicking. And then what we have worked on is also accessing private sector data, data that typically cannot be made available. That was kind of the third wave. And now, from my perspective, we're actually entering the fourth wave, where indeed Gen AI becomes the focus. On the one hand, where we have open data and data that can be used for fine-tuning or for RAG models, and I see many of the program here are actually touching on how do you develop data sets for RAG models. And open data, of course, can augment existing models in ways that you have context-specific AI applications on context-specific questions that can be answered as well. And on the other hand, and that's where, of course, we get really excited, is that you can actually start leveraging AI to democratize data. You can start using AI to improve data discoverability, and there are already many examples internally, for instance, in internal organizations where you can start using large language models to identify data that might be out there, because typically knowledge management in organizations is not always as one would hope, but large language models can actually deal with some of those challenges. And we can also see that AI can be used to improve the quality and also to actually provide a conversational interface with data, so that you not always need to have a data science degree to actually query data, but that you actually now have an interface that can do so, and we've seen many examples. At the same time, we also have learned that it's not so straightforward than just developing a chatbot, that you actually also need to think about, is the data actually ready as well? And so what we are focusing on is how do we prevent a data winter? How do we make sure that we actually have access to the data we need in order to address critical public needs? And how do we at the same time ride the fourth wave of open data, given the fact that we are in this weird situation where we have a decline of access, and at the same time we have new tools that can allow us to democratize data and can actually leverage the data that we have in a much better way, much faster way, and also much richer way as well. And that means that we actually have to rethink data stewardship, because one of the key, what I always call missing professions in the data ecosystem are actually data stewards, and data stewards that have a broader function quite often than a pure tactical function, because data stewards also need to become far more strategic on how they think about data and how they engage with the data ecosystem. And from my perspective, it requires 6 shifts in data stewardship. First one is go from focus on supply to also become more focused on the demand for data, because if you don't know what the questions are, how do you know what is the data you actually need and what's the data you should prioritize with regard to having access? The second one, and that will be a shocking surprise for many in the room, is that we need to go from kind of synthetic data sets to more the semantic kind of knowledge graphs that really would allow for interoperability and for this kind of relational understanding of data. We need to also broaden our perspective of open data and to include unstructured data. Most open data platforms are still about structured data, and of course, turns out LLMs kind of not really like structured data that much, and so we really need to also broaden our concept here. And then we need to also go from consent to social license, from fair to fair with double R, and from open data to data commons. Let me quickly, because I was supposed to speak very shortly and then have a conversation with the moderator, but let me quickly go through each of those and indicate what I mean by a new concept of data stewardship. And then the first one, as I said, is to really move from being supply-centric, meaning focusing on only the data, to also becoming more demand-centric, to become centric with regard to what are actually the key questions that matter with regard to a particular kind of problem, with regard to a particular kind of need for evidence that decision makers need. It turns out, as a society, we are very smart and with regard to data, we are kind of data rich, but when it comes to questions, we are very unsophisticated. I mean, that's why I've been calling for a new science of questions, where we complement data science, but that we actually also have a better way to understand what are the questions that matter for what problem, and then how do we then prioritize that. And that's why I launched a few years ago the 100 Questions Initiative, which was really an initiative to develop this new science of questions where we could actually prioritize what are the 100 questions that matter for which we already have data, but we have not prioritized access to that data because we have not prioritized the question for which we need access to the data as well. I'm not going to go into the methodology here. It suffices to say is that it actually requires a new taxonomy of questions so that people are more sophisticated in understanding what question matters for what problem and how do you structure the quest of questions. Because what I like about questions is the first part of it. It is actually a quest. How do you architect the inquiry is a key skill set that quite often is missing. And from my point of view, data stewards need to become far more sophisticated on how you actually also understand what is the question so that you then can prepare the data in ways that can answer the question that matters as well. Today, actually, we launch the 100 questions or the top 10 questions around women's health. We just finished an exercise on what are the key questions for women's health together with the Gates Foundation. And so those who are interested, today you can actually vote because we also have a public engagement about questions, vote on which of the 10 that have been selected by the kind of domain experts, which of the 10 resonates the most. Second, and this here I go quickly because we have all the experts in the room, we also, from a data stewardship perspective, and even from an open data perspective, we need to start working more on providing open knowledge graphs, right? Typically, open data stops at the data, but now we need more and more also access on actually the semantic, relational kind of graph that can be developed based upon kind of the data sets that you want to interlink. And this, of course, is fundamental for data spaces, right? I would say knowledge graphs are the infrastructure for data spaces, and we need to, from a data stewardship perspective, also becoming far more smarter about how we actually go about that and how we then also go beyond the synthetic and go into actually the semantic as well. Then, as I said, we need to really go into more of the unstructured data. We still spend a lot of time on structured data or even trying, there's a great session, trying, and I would love to learn, going from unstructured to structured because we still need some kind of course, semi-structured way to analyze it. But I have many colleagues now at NYU who actually do the opposite, right? How do you go from structured data to unstructured data? Because that's how quite often we see large language models actually can ingest some of the unstructured data with all kinds of challenges, I would say, attached to that. But we need to become more, especially when we talk about access to data, more kind of broader in our concept of data, because unstructured data becomes now also equally important. And of course, it has all kinds of complications, because typically unstructured data, i.e. content, was quite often not part of data management. It was part of something else, but not data management. And so we need to actually broaden that concept as well. Then the fourth part, and that goes to how do you do this responsibly, right? And here we need to go beyond consent, especially when, of course, we are talking about data that has been collected that might have personally identifiable information. Because from my point of view, consent is very important, as it's kind of the foundational principle in data governance, especially in Europe, of course, with GDPR. But consent, as we all know, is basically flawed. And it's flawed in multiple ways, right? Flawed, first of all, hardly ever informed, right? Secondly, it's actually not really agency. It's kind of a choice between two options that you have not determined what those options might be, right? It's either yes or no, opt-in or opt-out. And more importantly, it's always individual, which I think is kind of, from a data perspective, quite often problematic, because who am I to make decisions about data that could benefit society? And also, data, to a large extent, is relational. Meaning, if someone tries to figure out where was Stefaan at 9 o'clock, right? That means that my data actually tells something about all of you, because you happen to be in the same room where I'm also at the moment. And so we need to start thinking about how do we broaden the concept of concept, and that's why we have been working on a social license, where we actually can engage with communities around what is it that you actually prefer as it relates to certain kinds of use cases, and how would you feel about using or reusing that data? Because if we talk about reuse, i.e. using data for other purposes than initially collected, right, then consent also becomes harder and harder to actually obtain. And so we need new mechanisms, and we've developed several of those methodologies as well. Oops, and sorry. The last, the fifth element, and again, this will not be shocking for this audience, is that we need to broaden our principle of fair. Everyone, of course, is well established, right? Findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, but we also need to now include ready for AI. And ready for AI means that we also need to invest more time on actually data provenance, on sourcing, and making sure that the source is authoritative, because that ultimately determines also the quality, quite often, of the analysis, but also quality assurance, interoperability, data annotation, and so on. And of course, this has changed also, and is changing on a massively dynamic space with the arrival, of course, of model content protocols. We see that even the concept of what is AI-ready data is kind of changing, right? Because in the past, we had a problem is like, anyway, most of the data that we, by the way, looked into open data portals were not AI-ready. But now you can actually, with MCP, start making much faster progress on really ingesting some of that data for AI purposes. And then the last element I would say is that we also need to go beyond open data, because now we have this tension in the open data community where many feel uncomfortable about the fact that that data is being extracted in ways that they didn't anticipate, right? I mean, Wikipedia, right? I mean, let's put it that way. OpenAI would not exist without Wikipedia, right? And Wikipedia, to a large extent, is kind of the data set, and together with Common Crawl, the data set that really fuels a lot of the kind of model training and fine-tuning to a large extent. And what we have seen is that Wikipedia, for instance, is actually suffering. People don't go to Wikipedia anymore. They go to ChatGPT, and they get the same answer. And people don't contribute to Wikipedia anymore, because why would they? It's just training fodder for large corporations. And so we see this tension between being fully open and then being extracted, and on the other hand, of course, still be committed to the open data principles. And so that's why we need to come up with new models, which we have been working on, called data commons. It's not a shockingly new environment, but it is based upon principles of Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner, on how you actually governs resources in ways that are not extractive, that align with principles of and the preferences and expectations of those that actually have created the data or make the data accessible and well. And we need a lot more of those initiatives, and we already have documented several, and we actually gave 2 prizes to data commons in New York during the United Nations General Assembly as well. Happy to talk about that later as well. But I'm going to stop here by saying is that the future really should focus on how do we develop data stewardship to build fair commons. Commons that are findable, data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, but also ready for AI. And how do we make this data accessible in ways that are not extracted, in ways that actually benefits the larger community, including the data community. And that requires a new concept of data stewardship, stewards as bridges, but also stewards that really understand the demand side and the fact that data is a public good that need to be managed in particular ways as well. So with that, I hope that we can all join each other to prevent a data winter and to really ride the 4th wave of open data so that we really have the best of times and the spring of hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefaan. Wow, provocative, provocative. And how can a conference like Endorse perhaps help to shed light on how to deal with that 4th wave?
Well, as I mentioned, there are multiple ways to ride the 4th wave, and I think in this group of people here, I think many of the solutions to actually ride the 4th wave are the solutions you work on. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to make this far more, create far bigger awareness about the importance of knowledge graphs, the importance of really thinking about AI-ready data that is both qualitative but also have strong provenance. And of course, the whole reference data community has been doing that for many years. So I think we need to really leverage that capacity and the skill set that is there and really apply it to kind of the new, which of course quite often is always new, right? But ultimately we can build upon the foundations that we have, but then also realize that there are new tools that can help kind of the making data AI ready that we need to start leveraging as well. And it also means that we actually need to really invest in the human infrastructure. I mean, my point of view is that there's a lot of focus on the technical infrastructure, there's a lot of focus on the policy infrastructure, especially in Europe, which is great, yeah. But we forget the human infrastructure. We have now tools like the Data Act and the Data Governance Act, yeah. But unfortunately none of this will be implemented in meaningful ways if we don't have the people that actually know how to go about providing access to data in ways that is systematic, sustainable, and responsible. And I think that's kind of where we need to go.
When you mentioned data winter, I think about how, like maybe about two decades ago, we were talking about the info highway, the wide open info highway. And now you're talking about roadblocks, toll booths, and so forth. Are you pessimistic or optimistic that we can overcome that?
It depends on the day. Well, I mean, overall, as I said, typically I'm not a pessimistic person, but this is kind of the first time I really, I'm kind of alarmist when it comes to data. And I think we actually see this backsliding and the fact that there is no accountability quite often anymore in actually how do you make sure that the data is accessible. And I do think that actually, anyone who cares about the AI summer should care about the data winter. Because from my point of view, the AI summer might be short-lived if we actually don't figure out how do we develop access to data in a less extractive way, but still in an open way. And I think there are ways to do that, but I don't see that much activity at the moment, unfortunately. Wow. And especially large data holders are kind of really moving away from the FAIR principles, which I think is kind of troubling to me, yeah.
Well, we've had lots of questions come in for you via Slido, so let me put one of those to you. One question is, in the presentation you pointed to the role of data stewardship in the mediation of competing interests. Can you please expand on how that enables fair are principles?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I'm just back, by the way, I couldn't be here yesterday because we do boot camps for data stewards. And so I was in Berlin for 3 days. We had a 3-day intensive data stewards boot camp. And so it will take me 3 days to answer that question. No, I'm joking. But basically, as I said, in our perspective, data stewards are individuals or teams, it doesn't have to be one person, of course, that ultimately seek to work to provide access to data for reuse in systematic, sustainable, and responsible ways, right? And that means that you need that kind of capability both on the data user side, capabilities to be able to actually request data in ways that is more systematic, sustainable, and responsible, and then capabilities on the data holder side. Because, surprise, surprise, you need both. And too often, we focus either on the data holder side and invest there, but then there is no data stewardship capability on the ones that actually need data. And unless you have those kinds of interactive exchanges between teams that have those skill sets, it's very hard to actually set this up. And we have seen this over and over again. I mean, we've tried to create multiple data collaboratives, but if you don't have kind of dedicated teams that really understand what is the question, what's the value, what's the vision that we seek to establish, and then have the capabilities to deliver, right? Because there's a distinction between vision and delivery, then we actually have seen many data collaboratives basically collapse. And so that's kind of the bridge function that we need and the translation function that we need as well.
Ah, we have a question out here. Yes, Paul, please. Paul Groth. Groth. Punch it again. There we go.
Yeah, hey. Paul Groth, University of Amsterdam. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about this idea of the unstructured data, and in particular, with relevance to the EU and AI. So here's a take, or here's a question. Do you think the EU, through its open data initiatives, could be a supplier of tokens and create an environment where AI companies, or we could develop EU-based AI companies because we have the best open data token market? Is that a crazy idea, or is that a good idea, or somewhere in between?
No, I mean, that's from my point of view, that's the kind of the future thinking with regard to open data, right? And that's what I'm trying to emphasize is that, of course, anyway, for large language models, it's basically tokens, and then of course verified and validated kind of content to establish knowledge tokens to a large extent. So I think that's the opportunity here, right? And that's where we really need to embrace the fourth wave, right? We need to actually say, okay, it's the other elements remain important. Open data portals remain important, but how do we then build upon that and create new kinds of platforms, token repositories, as I said, knowledge graphs repositories, equally important, and I think that's really the opportunity. And we see some are doing this already, right? But I think that's where we need to kind of focus more our attention, because I feel like a lot of the conversation is still kind of in the second wave. and what I'm trying to anyway argue is that actually don't miss the fourth wave, and how do we actually leverage that by building new, and I would say commons kind of approaches for accessing those knowledge tokens or tokens, depending on how you go about it. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Slido for you. This question is from Peter Winstanley. It's about, essentially, there's a lot of discussion about whether it's fair to use people's information that they've worked on when there's AI scraping of the data. So Peter asks, how do we compensate people for the use of their information so that we nurture the giving of quality data? Could the blood donor model of social responsibility be used?
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple models, right? So one is kind of the donation model, and of course the Data Governance Act allows and enables data donation, which is kind of reference to the blood donor kind of concept. But then, of course, the real question here is then, so what, as we all know, blood donors is not always successful either, right? And so then it's about, anyway, how do we actually incentivize, how do we create this kind of public awareness about the importance of the data And that's where I feel like we need a lot more public conversation about the value of data. Most of the conversation is about preventing misuse of data, but we don't have conversations about the missed uses of data because we don't have access to data, right? And if we would say, look, these are all the questions, right, that we cannot answer, and that if answered, life would be better if we would have be able to answer it, then people would start realizing that they actually can contribute to start answering those questions, but too often the conversation is kind of abstract. So the data donation, absolutely one model, but if we look at the implementation of the Data Governance Act with regard to data donation, I'm not that optimistic, to be quite honest. We haven't seen that much activity in that space. So we need to come with real new models. That also means that we need to come up with new licensing regimes, right? Because anyway, from my point of view, we need a tiered licensing approach where, yes, if you use data for research, you use data for public interest purposes, go for it. But if you start using it for commercial applications or you start using it in ways that is extractive, then you should have kind of a separate licensing regime that involves a different pricing structure in order to sustain the ecosystem, yeah, from my point of view.
Okay, before we go to a question here, I want to, because this one has 8 thumbs up, and I'm having trouble getting my head around it. The Swift knowledge graphs implies the need of structured data and not unstructured. Isn't there a contradiction in this point? Do you?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
that's the kind of the challenge at the moment, right? Is that anyway, how much unstructured versus structured? Meaning there are ways to deal with unstructured data that, and again, goes back to the token question as well, that of course relates to particular tokens that provides then the relationships that you have. And the question is, anyway, does knowledge graphs require structured data in order to be able to make the relations between kind of the entities, right? And depending on the ontologies that you use. I mean, I think there are much smarter people in the room to actually start answering that question. I don't think it's an either or from my perspective. And I think we need to really start looking into, as I said, developments in the space, because this is a very dynamic space where in the past, as I said, meaning some people went from kind of unstructured data, making it unstructured because there was an assumption that you always need to have unstructured. Now we go from unstructured data to structured. I think there are multiple middle ways to actually deal with that kind of content as well. And again, it depends on the application, right? And that's also where we need to start becoming smarter about kind of taxonomies of AI. Is this about generative AI, right? Then of course we go to token developments. Is this about kind of more factual AI? Yeah. That's a whole different kind of environment, right?
Okay, and let's go to the question here. Vasilis.
Okay, so I will insist on this topic, and actually one of the biggest buzzwords of this conference.
Present yourself again, so we.
I'm Vasilis Tsouvaras from the Publications Office.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would like to ask that one of the biggest buzzwords of this conference and in general is this AI-ready data.
Yeah.
And we know that Europe is investing a lot in AI, is building these AI factories. That's a new thing. And we want to connect the AI factories with the data spaces and so on. So what exactly is this AI-ready data, and what is the difference from the non-AI-ready data? Can you a little bit elaborate on this, please?
Yeah, no, so the question was, what's the difference between non-AI ready data and AI ready data, right? And that's a really good question, right? I do think there are, well, first of all, I would say the good news about AI is that it has made us more aware about quality, the importance of quality, and more aware about the importance of provenance to a large extent, right? And so this was already important before, for sure, but I think when we talk about AI-ready data, then it's about doubling down on actually the importance of quality data and having well-developed and documented kind of sourced data that you understand where was it from and how is it being developed as well. And I think to a large extent, you could say it's the same. I think we do need to develop new metadata standards for actually encompassing kind of new elements that we want to add to the metadata in terms of a potential bias, for instance, that is in the data that might become complicated when you actually start using it for AI, and also to really have a better understanding how a lot of this data was annotated, which is different than traditional data, for instance, as well. So yeah, there are, of course, similarities. And I have to say, a lot of this discussion about AI-ready data is quite often confused because many in the AI space quite often ignore the massive advances that were made in data management because they typically don't come from data management. And so we have seen this already, that some of them are kind of coming out. We need data sheets now. And so the question is, well, what's the difference between a data sheet and metadata that we've been working on? So just to answer your question, I think there are some differences, but obviously good data management practices and principles are becoming more important than ever before, and that's kind of the message here.
Okay, next we have two questions from Mark Dietrich. First question, are there practical methods for AI tools to incorporate the access and use rules set by data owners? Right now, it seems that this information is immediately stripped from the training methods. Second question, if the fourth wave is Gen AI, how do we avoid amplification of bad information without an exponential increase in manpower to steward the data?
And can you repeat the first one?
Yes, it was the practical methods for AI tools to incorporate access and use rules.
Yeah, again, I will be very, it's a big question. Well, so anyway, just on the first one, as I said, I mean, we've seen a lot of interesting applications on using AI for data discovery, right? And this is especially in areas where you didn't have that well-established knowledge management practices in organizations, for instance, and then you can actually start using AI for discovery of data sets, discovery of actually content that might be relevant for particular kind of applications. We also see the use of something called data contracts, which again, some of you have worked on, which basically indicates that this is the requirements of the data we have. You put it, you connect it with actually AI so that AI can start evaluating the data before they ingest it, evaluating the data in alignment with the data contract. And that's kind of another interesting application so that you actually don't have, anyway, they can start automating assessments of data quality and then also subsequently potentially contribute to improving of it. And then the last question is, of course, related to, well, I mean, again, the whole notion of garbage in, garbage out is more pronounced than ever. And I think that's not new as well. But of course, what we now have as well is that we might have quality in and garbage out. And then starting using that garbage as kind of input. And I think that's the real kind of challenge, especially as it relates to kind of the creation of synthetic data, which I didn't even go into detail, because that's another aspect from data stewardship that we need to start working on, is how do we become more sophisticated around synthetic data? Because synthetic data can be good, right, if it's used for privacy-enhancing, as a privacy-enhancing technology. But it can be problematic if it is synthetic data that has been generated by the Gen AI and then started to be used as training data, which of course, anyway, if you talk to any AI engineer, they all fear model collapse at the moment because of the fact that a lot of the data that is being used is actually now synthetically generated data, right? And I mean, I typically have a chart that goes to kind of, if you do a search on Google these days, and especially images at Google, I would say 50% of the images that you get back today are AI generated. And so if you start using those images, then it becomes really problematic, right? So it's kind of, anyway, a dog starting to eat its own food and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. We have like a minute left. And I've got l'embarras du choix, as you say in French. It's unbelievable. Is it possible that maybe Stefaan can see these questions later, the ones that we didn't address? Is that? That would be fabulous, because it's very frustrating. I wish we could get to briefly.
Yeah, Claudio Baldassare from Saming Digit. why shouldn't we just stop? We'll see we're heading into just, what can be hell. And since 4 years, I mean, it's not too long ago that we started with this, 2020, 2021. Why shouldn't we just stop because all of this is spinning more and more and more issues, especially with reference to what you just said. There is so much now generative AI data that people who don't have memory in a few years, they would not just make any difference.
Yeah, we can have a conversation about that.
At coffee break.
But there is this constant tension, right, between, on the one hand, exactly how do you have those that say we need to accelerate, right? And by the way, those are the ones that are because there's this fight, right, at the moment to update constantly new versions of models, right? It's kind of it's a fight that leads to all those problems, right? And so so you have those that said we need to accelerate, but those are the ones that ultimately try to be the ones that own the market, let's put it that way. And then you have, of course, those that are starting to ring the alarm bells and say we need to stop. Now, good luck with that, I would say. So the question is then, of course, how do we really infuse this kind of treadmill that we are on, right? How do we infuse it with better practices? And that's why I've been focusing on actually the human infrastructure, right? That we need in order to do this better, right? We need to actually have people that really understand, which is what you all have been working on, really understand what does good look like, right? And that's, from my point of view, kind of ignored, because as I said, many of the AI people don't come out of the data management world, right? And they just basically, started ingesting data because they could, right? And because they found a model to generate predictive answers, because generative AI, the only thing it does is basically prediction, right? And so that's my concern, is that unless we actually bring data stewards back into the ecosystem, it will be hard. But yes, some days I also reminded perhaps we should stop. And it generates me other part that we start working on more and more is actually digital well-being, because there are correlations between what we see in society and what's happened in the information space, right? And I think those correlations becoming far more problematic as this is evolving.
Mm. And this is very much a transatlantic divide on this question, I think, too. Lots more to talk about during the course of the day. Thank you very much, Stefaan. How about a round of applause?